Kemar, I'll send you back the link once you're live so you can share with them. You're live in 2, 3. Kemar may also make you a co-host just in case anything. If it fails the internet, you are good to go. All right.
Yeah.
If the internet fails, you'll be one ticket. Or you're live on Facebook. Kemar, I'm just gonna make you a host here. Co-host. Okay, go ahead. Kemar, your co-host. All right, guys, you're live on Facebook. Good night.
Right. Yes. Good night to everyone. Good night to all of our viewers. Again, we are back for another Thursday of the DeBrief Finance and Business Show. I am your host, Kemar Stuart, and this evening we promise to have a very riveting discussion with such an expert panel. So, again, thank you for tuning in. As you know, we usually take 1 second to allow persons to sign on and to get the viewership up, to share the link. And yeah, so first I'd like to tell you a little bit, well, not really me, but I'll let them introduce themselves to you. I know there's a very familiar face here that people may want to engage. Two familiar faces, really, that people may want to engage. So I'm really hoping that you ask your questions, because we do take questions coming in from the live. So let's get right into it. First, I'd like to introduce Mr. Terrence Yip. Terrence is an economics and financial professional and a partner of Ideal Professional Services. Terrence, you could give a brief introduction of yourself, please.
Yeah, I've recently formed with Ken Clark a group called Ideal Advisory Services, and where we offer a range of financial advice, such as credit risk, market risk, auditing, AML, forensic accounting, a whole wide range of services that a typical, let's say, company would require at some stage of their operation. And we've been operating for about coming close to 3 years now. My background, I retired from Royal Bank of Canada in 2015, and subsequently I did some teaching at Mona, and then we started this company. So I have about, let's say, 30 years of, let's say, financial experience, various countries, including the Middle East, UK, Caribbean, USA, and let me see where I left on, probably Guernsey and Jersey, Channel Islands. What else? Previously, I graduated from McGill that's years now ago, 1986, with a PhD in economics, and my expertise was really modeling and financial economics.
Thank you, Terrence. Over to you, Ayana.
Good night to everybody. I hope that some of my students are watching. I am Ayana Young Marshall. I am an attorney by training, but my substantive work is carried out at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, where I am the lecturer in international business. And I also coordinate a program called SEED, which is the Student Entrepreneurial Empowerment Development. And that program, which takes up the majority of my time, is geared at supporting students and the public at large in considering and starting a business. It is rooted in the whole agenda of offering people access to more tertiary education, or offering more people access to tertiary education, and recognizing that there were not commensurate jobs in the labor force. So that's the agenda. There are many more things I can talk about. Congratulations, Kemar. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you. We look forward to engaging you tonight into this expert topic. Last but certainly not least, our expert in international business. Many of you may know her from being actively involved in the political scene. She's the former minister, government minister in Barbados as well. But I'll let her tell you. I don't want to, steal her thing. So over to you, Miss Eastman.
Okay, so thanks very much for inviting me to participate tonight. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion with the expert panel which you have put together. I'm an attorney at law in private practice currently. Before that, I was, as you said, a minister of government and a senator in the Ministry of Commerce. I was also the director of international business, and under that remit, I also took responsibility for negotiations in trade and services, the CARICOM. At that time, we had set up the regional negotiating machinery. And also I was lead negotiator for double taxation agreements and investment treaties for Barbados during that period of time. Before I joined the government service, I was a senior international tax manager with the firm of Price Waterhouse, which is now PricewaterhouseCoopers. And before that, I started out in private practice. Academically, I have a master's from the University of London in commercial law, and also a first degree in law from the University of the West Indies. I was also a research fellow for the International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very impressive. Very impressive CVs tonight. So this promises to be a very intellectual and stimulating discussion. First, I just want to say good night to Simon Aline and good night to Akil Daly and all the others who are tuning on the live. I hope you guys will ask some questions to these professionals so we can hear them speak tonight. So let's get into it. While we're here, we're discussing the international business and financial services sector, along with the impacts on the economy. We're not sticking to Barbados only, we are going regional. And since we have Terence on board, who is domiciled in Canada, we hope to hear somewhat about that. So the international business sector, that's basically the offshore finance sector. With a long and respect the history, I think Ms. Eastman played a huge role in it within her time in government and building that sector to what it is now. And the sector has been having some challenges during the last couple of years, and we're going to touch on a point that she made about the double taxation treaties. And I know Barbados had a preferential agreement with Canada, where we were able to repatriate, I think is dividend or income back to Canada. I think it was tax-free, if I recall. But that arrangement changed when Canada passed their legislation to have that service extended to a whole other set of Caribbean countries, which offered better taxation rates and better preferential rates than us, which saw us losing huge chunks of money from our tax revenues going over to these other countries, and the sector would have definitely taken a hit as it relates to income. So we're going to start there and ask her to fill in a little bit of the blanks in that respect, help us to understand these respective treaties and the benefits of the treaties, and how can it help us right now within this whole COVID pandemic.
I would say that it might be useful to go back to what was intended when the international business legislation was first passed. And we have to give credit to the people involved in it at the time were Bree St. John, Tom Adams, and Israeli. Those are the key people who take credit for having formulated the sector in the modern form, because there are those who would argue that it had existed before that, but in the 1980s, an effort was made to reform it. And if you look at the legislation back in that time, when that legislation was passed, you would see that the intention was not to simply focus on financial services, but to focus on a broad range of services and also manufacturing, that all of these should benefit from the international business legislation. What developed out of that was an interest in the Barbados arrangement. Barbados had a treaty with Canada, and Barbados had many other treaties because somebody had the foresight when we became independent to hold on to the treaties that the UK had negotiated with other countries. So when you look at, or even before we started the new round of negotiating treaties, you would see that we had treaties with countries like Norway. And that was because in Barbados, someone said, well, let's do our best to hold on to these treaties way back when we became independent. And that was very important. You know, sometimes people believe that the older people contributed nothing and were not savvy. But I really think that it was important that somebody had the foresight to do that. So from the outset, when the question was raised as to whether we're a treaty nation in terms of taxation, we were able to say yes, because we have this whole list of treaties with the Nordic countries and other countries as well, the UK, et cetera, that we had held on to. So where Canada is concerned, that was interesting because the benefit actually came from domestic Canadian legislation, which said that they would allow this exempt surplus if the companies were resident in a country that had a double taxation agreement with Canada. And you're correct, the Canadian government decided to change that process. We also engaged in negotiations with Canada all around this time in around the early 2000s, where Canada sought to ensure that none of the international business companies, and when I say that, we had IBC legislation, we also had banking legislation, we had foreign sales corporation legislation, we had exempt insurance legislation. And the objective of those negotiations was to ensure that those companies did not benefit from the double taxation agreement. So therefore, that particular, is though that Canada took a long time before it ever implemented. We knew well in advance that Canada was going to do this, because it wasn't just Canada, Barbados. This was a movement across the international community. You would see that, for example, the Netherlands, for example, had a whole structure where it used to attract headquarters companies. And that particular regime was attacked as well and dismantled. So what I'm saying is that we knew it was coming. We knew it was coming. And to be honest, my view is that we should have prepared better for it.
Well, in terms of preparation for it, I would agree with you in saying that if we knew something should have happened to stop the slide, I think the loss of the revenue from the sector at that time was very critical, and it placed a big hole within the government finances, which helped to contribute to the economic slide that we went through within that period. Now, what I will ask you, and then we can extend the question out to the other panelists. What was so special about St. Lucia, and what was so special about the other countries that they would have decided to leave Barbados and go and domicile in these other countries?
Well, Barbados had always sought to impose tax on, well, except for the exempt insurance companies, we had always sought to impose some level of taxation on all of the entities that we had here. There were other countries who did not, which did not. So they would not tax any of these entities. So then if a country found itself in a position where it could benefit from exempt surplus anywhere, well then, and there was no tax in those jurisdictions, it made sense for them to go to those jurisdictions. I mean, it's just a matter of calculating taxes. And in many instances, those countries seem to be, better. So I'm not sure that all of the companies decided to go to St. Lucia or anywhere else. Some of them probably also just decided to wind up their offshore entities, their branches or their subsidiaries. And that might have been the action that some took as well.
Yeah, I think Lynette is right on that latter point. I don't think you can lay all at the doorstep of this taxing the excess. If you look at what's been happening the last, let's say, 7 years in CARICOM, the economies there have been really growing very slowly, and in fact, the growth has been stagnant in many of the jurisdictions. You see that most palpably in Jamaica, for example, where you have rising non-performing loans for years and years. We also see that in Trinidad and Tobago, and right across the board, you had this very slow growth, especially in construction, and even I would say even in traditional tourism. And I think it's a question there really of profitability. The Canadian banks were really struggling in the last 6 or 7 years, and they have limited capital to allocate. So what they're doing now is trying to strategize. Now, do I put a penny more in the CARICOM countries, or do I downsize? Do I pull back? I think that's what they're doing. Not only the Canadian banks. If you look at internationally, look at HSBC, for example. They just decided they would sell out in USA. All the bricks and mortar retail banking type of stuff are very labor intensive, and they use up a lot of capital. And HSBC hasn't really dented the market, hasn't really made any inroads, and now they're moving out to Asia. So I think it's a question really of the profit outlook, probably also the legislation, but I think it's mostly economy and how the prospects for profit look like in the next 5 to 6 years. Now, of course, the COVID thing doesn't help. That's going to delay recovery in the Caribbean for a good 6, 7 years before we get back to the previous peak. I mean, if you look at the history of these shocks, it takes a long time in the Caribbean before these countries get back to a previous, let's say, real GDP per capita. For example, in the 1990s, it took 10 years for Bahamas to get back to peak. It took 9 years for Barbados to get back to peak. And in the last recession, 2008, 2009, they've been really struggling to get back to a sub-decent level of growth. So altogether, I think it's mostly profit and balance sheet impacts.
Thank you, Terrence. Ayana, you want to make a comment to what was the question?
Sure, thank you.
On the floor.
Well, so far the discussion has focused on the financial side of international business, but we approach international business more generally, so that we look at the conduct of business internationally and what we have been doing recently, regardless of sector, whether service, whether products, and so on. And it's good to get the history from Lynette in terms of what was originally intended by the framers or the ones who conceptualize the sector. So I think that what we have seen is a sort of shrinking of the traditional financial services interpretation of international business. And that opens up an opportunity for all of the other products and services that we are capable of being involved in from an international business standpoint that can benefit from that favorable legislative framework. And you've seen that, you know. So I think that in terms of the question that you've asked at the beginning as it relates to responding to COVID, when somebody stops you from doing one thing, then clearly you're going to get into something else. So you have seen, and it's interesting to see that Lynette, for example, has got involved in the cultural industries. You know, there are different sectors that we need to pay attention to, and perhaps we can discuss some of those things. So we look at we recognize that it's not just multinationals that can be involved in international business. We recognize that we accept that whole concept of nano firms, which is Richard Bernal's concept. And his famous nano firms article speaks about the role of the CSME as that vehicle that will help these nano firms, you know, ever achieve that level of international competitiveness that has been promised. The CSME is a whole different discussion, but I think that we still need to explore some of its promises in order to understand where some of the opportunities lie. So I will leave the discussion on financial services to the three of you, but I'll insert some broad perspective on the general areas that we can focus on from an international business standpoint. And there are many, you know, and there's some that we have been involved in already, but not doing properly. And then there are others that we are trying to do brand new, you know, so those are my initial comments.
Yeah, well, I would definitely appreciate that other perspective in terms of the other areas of international business. According to Peter Booth, who's the chairman emeritus of Ernst & Young Barbados, he provided an industry guide for the international business sector. So he spoke about agriculture, he spoke about construction, energy, and utilities. Terrence, and speaking of Terrence has a background in understanding the gas and mining sector in Trinidad. And you know, Guyana is about to go through a large oil boom. So we're definitely going to want to have some conversation on the energy sector from an international business perspective. As I said, there were export services. We mentioned financial services. There's the ICT technology services, manufacturing. There's the new areas that are popping up, which is the global market development, green business, renewable energy. There are new niche areas in taxation and financial regulation. But for this show, I want to touch a little bit on the I want to touch on the money laundering aspect of things before we get into things, because I know money laundering is a big topic. Barbados is constantly being blacklisted by the European Union and the OECD. Britain has no issue their own blacklists, and we seem to can't keep off of these blacklists regardless of what we do. And I think that is causing serious reputational damage for Barbados. We also had a former minister who was charged. I think that, again, serious reputational damage for the country. I know the government made some changes as it relates to its international business structure, trying to bring the offshore sector onshore and have it measured within our domestic space. But there's still a sort of like a ring fencing, just using their quotation, a ring fencing of the sector, but still trying to measure it locally. They reduced the tax rate, which was down to, I believe, Lynette, you correct me, I think it was like, there's a sliding scale between 1 or 2% for some companies,
Yes.
and it's like, 1 or 2%.
Between 1 and 5.5%.
Yeah. which is fairly low. When I had Dr. Anki Scott Joseph on the panel, she was concerned about how low can we really go. And I know in other jurisdictions, these companies sometimes pay zero tax. But like I said, these actions of Caribbean economies in the international business sector are often threats to the larger financial sectors like in London and New York and Europe and Brussels and these places. And in my opinion, I think that they use their institutional power to coerce small states into giving up these incomes because they themselves want to benefit from the income. And we use these institutions to say, well, hey, these countries are money laundering, and I would issue the respective blacklist. So I want your perspective on the money laundering issue. What can we do to get out of these or get off of these respective blacklists and yeah, just basically paint some context of how you feel about the money laundering, the progress, if you've seen any progress coming out from the governments in terms of trying to combat the money laundering, if there any specific legislation that you may like, any actions that you may like. Feel free to share any perspective you want on the topic.
I could just comment briefly on it because I kind of touched on it in a recent book I wrote on rags to riches. It deals with Guyana's oil scenario. But I touched on Barbados when I was putting up a graph on perceptions of corruption index. And I was looking at Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. And what struck me was that Barbados in 2009, around that period, they were in the 70 range and they were in the top 15 or 20 top countries for low corruption. And that graph has been sliding ever since. And now it's heading to 60. So what you just mentioned is probably something that didn't happen overnight. It's like being a sort of a gradual trend which nobody is noticing, but it accumulates over time. And that is shocking because offshore banking, as Leonard would tell you, needs transparency and all these nice things to survive. Like Singapore then. Singapore would crumble in a second if there were to be massive corruption in that state. And countries like Barbados, Bahamas, which rely on offshore banking, need to really pay attention to these things. Perception and reality, yes, perception becomes reality in this kind of a scenario.
Yeah. Ayana, Lynette, you wanna tackle that?
Okay. Now, I always find it interesting that whenever you're talking about financial services, there's a shift into money laundering, as if the two go hand in hand. And that's not necessarily the case. But I understand why that happens, because that has been the perception and it has been promoted by, I guess, recognized organizations like Oxfam, et cetera. They've done their best to paint countries, small countries, because they don't do that to the larger ones or the ones that they depend upon, like Hong Kong. They try to paint large countries in a very negative light. And I even found that in the days when it was very difficult in dealing with these international organizations, there were even local people who I think supported the organizations. They said things like, why would you come and do business in Barbados if you could do it in England, London? You know, because we still have that perception that everybody wants to be in London or Toronto or New York. So that is part of the difficulty. What I would say is that as far as money laundering is concerned, countries or international organizations are not necessarily only concerned with the financial services sector. they are concerned with money laundering anywhere. So that you will find that money laundering, the rules with respect to money laundering and the legislation with respect to money laundering is not only targeted at financial institutions, even though they might be the ones who bear the brunt of it, or who they might be most suspicious of. But in any kind of transaction where you can have large amounts of cash being transferred, such as in real estate transactions, you will find that individuals or organizations in the money laundering framework are interested in those. So they're interested in accountants, they're interested in lawyers, they're interested in real estate, yes, the financial institutions, anyone who they consider to be a gatekeeper. Now, the last report that I read, I don't remember, it might have been in 2020. The thing that concerned those organizations was not that Barbados had not passed legislation. Now, if you look, we have a whole suite of legislation dealing with anti-money laundering initiative, proceeds of crime, et cetera, et cetera. But their concern is that when the report comes from Barbados, there are no prosecutions for money laundering.
That's true.
So that is what they note.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that Barbadians should bear in mind that when we speak on call-in programs, when we write on Facebook, etc., all of these things, and I'm not talking about surveillance, I'm talking about the fact that people who are here within the diplomatic corps, it is their job to report what is happening in Barbados. So if there's a perception of corruption within Barbados because of what people say, because people complain about having to bribe somebody, et cetera, they're going to be paying attention to that and they're going to be reporting. So then it should not be a surprise that these institutions would say, yes, you've passed all the legislation. It looks very nice on the books, but how come nobody is being prosecuted in Barbados, especially for white collar crime? Is everybody pristine, clean? And you will find that charges of money laundering tend to be tacked on to other offenses. Sometimes it seems to me like, okay, well, let's put on a money laundering charge so that at least we could put that in our list when we're reporting about how many money laundering cases we've actually prosecuted. But that has been the concern. So the point that I would like us to go away with, which Mr. Yak referred to, is the fact that in terms of perception of corruption, Barbados is being perceived as being more and more corrupt. And it isn't because of the financial services sector, it is because generally the country is being viewed in that way. Well, that's my view.
I'll add one point to that, Lynette, and I think you're absolutely right. It's the Bahamas and Barbados, they have all the legislation. There's no question about that. But what the EU Commission faulted Bahamas recently for was not the lack of legislation, but the lack of enforcement. That's where they nailed them on the blacklist. And I think the same thing probably applies to Barbados. The perception that people are not brought to justice. Yeah. And in the case of Bahamas, it was not just AML, it was tax evasion. That too was a big thing. And the EU, of course, put them on the blacklist. I think now they've been removed because they've made subsequent changes, or they must have tightened up restrictions, or maybe put people to jail, I don't know. But enforcement has improved. But I think that's the nub of the problem, is the enforcement. And you know something, as a general commentary, we could have all the legislation in the world. all the governance rules. But if you have no enforcement, it's useless. You know, we'll talk about Guyana soon. They might have all the great rules of governance and corruption, but it's going to happen if the courts are not powerful enough, or let's say independent enough to bring people to justice. So
But
it's a big problem there.
thank you, Terrence. Ayana, before you tackle that one, just wanted to say good night to some other guests. Thank you, Cameron, for tuning in. Thank you, Wayne Ved. Good night to Paul Gibson. Thank you, Wayne Hoyt, for tuning in. Marion Griffith and David Waldron. Again, just saying good night to you guys and thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to send your questions. One, Cameron said corruption has not stopped. The only problem with our friend is that he took his overseas and the others are keeping theirs in Barbados. Ray Hoyt said that those charges are somewhat difficult to prove. Over to you, Ayana.
Yeah, well, I agree with my colleagues. I agree, and they more or less were making the same point, that we don't prosecute, we don't enforce. So we do have the legislation. I think that countries like ours, we don't have enough of a voice. And in the earlier days, when we were able to respond to these organizations trying to box us in and box us down, we did it collectively, and that regional effort has it's waned, it's failed. So that when Barbados attempts to speak, it's just Barbados, whereas it can be a larger number, and that's we have expertise in this area. We have a track record, so I think that is part of it. A lot of it, when we look at our trading partners or look at our competitors in financial services, they are more corrupt than we are. They're measured and so forth. But I suppose I can accept the point that they prosecute more, but it is not that we are necessarily deserving of the label, just as we were not deserving of the labels 2 decades ago, but we're not. We need to holler back and say, well, this isn't true. This is, and prove what we have done, and to prove that we are still collaborating regionally to ensure that intra-regional transfers of money and so on are not being stained by money laundering. So it's diplomacy and so on. And we have to ask ourselves if we are using our diplomatic connections and so forth effectively as we used to. So I wanted to insert that one as well.
Well, thank you very much. You just made an interesting point that leads me on to my next point of discussion, and that is of correspondent banking and how the region is under threat from these countries. And I'm just using the term language de-risking from within the regional banks. Terrence made the point about banks leaving the Caribbean, and without the COVID and profitability, banks were under significant pressure from these institutions to cut their correspondent banking relationships. So you're seeing things like MoneyGram and what's called the local one here, the wire transfer companies.
Western Union.
Yes, Western
and
Union.
Many others that are springing up. Many other entrepreneurial ventures are springing up.
Yeah. So you were seeing challenges with them, and I don't think people understand the relationship between correspondent banks and the financial institutions and how of a impact that will have on our livelihoods and being able to receive money from friends, even if we receive money from businesses and how expensive it is really to do business for some of these banks. So on the issue of correspondent banking, the audience, for who don't know, who answers first to tell us a little bit about what correspondent banking really is and the different impacts that correspondent banking will have on us in the region, and if there's anything that could be done to improve the shocks that will come on us from these, or the absence of these correspondent banking relationships.
You want me to explain a little bit on that?
Yes, I think that
Yes.
would be, I think that would
Okay.
be a good,
Well, what correspondent banking is essentially a relationship amongst banks to settle transfer payments. So let's say, for example, a Jamaican worker is sending back remittances to Kingston. Okay, he has a bank in Kingston, maybe NCB, but to send that money to Kingston, he's got to take that money to a Canadian bank, and the Canadian bank will then send the money to the Kingston bank, NCB. Now, the Canadian bank now is taking a risk, because what if NCB doesn't repay Royal Bank? You see that? So what the correspondent banking does is really is a relationship between banks to ease transfer of funds. It could be direct between two banks, or it could be among three banks, where the settlement could be by a third bank in, say, New York, Wells Fargo, or something. But at any rate, it's a mutual relationship where money flows and monies are settled. Now, when, for example, Royal Bank says we're going to stop doing correspondent banking relationships with a Jamaican bank or a Barbados bank or a St. Lucia bank, it eventually stops the payment of money across borders. And that was just gum up all business, if you can think of it. It's not just workers sending back money, monies for remittances, people pick fruit in the summer, they send back quite a bit of money. But it gums up commerce. For example, a Jamaican firm wants to import goods from Germany, it has to settle in German marks. Okay, so a Jamaican bank now would make the settlement to a German bank. But how does the Jamaican bank feel comfortable that having made the payment, it would then receive compensation or for whatever transfer was made? So you could see the whole thing affects not just personal transfers, but businesses as usual, the flow of goods, imports and exports.
may I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Yes, so this has been an issue for some time, at a concern. Where would you say we are right now, where that is concerned?
You mean
The correspond,
progress?
yes. And there's always a fear that exactly what you said would occur. And there are branches which are closing. It seems as though some of the international banks that we have are retreating to home base. So how would you describe the current situation in the region? Are we still to be concerned at this point in time, or do you think there's some level of stability?
I think the Caribbean should still be concerned because of this perception of money laundering, fear on fear. And the foreign banks don't want to take that risk because it could be slapped hard with fines by the US authorities or even Canadian authorities. So that risk is always there. I think over the long run, the solution would be where you have some really solid banks. Let's say in Jamaica, you have some 2 or 3 good banks, which have a good reputation, for doing business. Similarly, you will have it in Barbados and Trinidad. So local banks could still play a role. They will still have some connections with foreign banks, but it will have to be a joint effort with the government and the public to, in a way, remove that kind of a perception and to show results that they are improving in stopping, illicit funds getting across and like that.
Is there a certain limitation for the economies that do not have their own banks? Because like in Barbados, we don't have a local bank. And most of our transactions, in fact, all of our transactions are conducted through the mostly Canadian
Well, I think I have the feeling that not all the Canadian banks are downsizing. I don't have a feeling that they are closing down the Caribbean. That's my impression. There's no question that they are downsizing bricks and mortar retail banking. There's no question about that. Things could not be done online. But I think there still will be a presence in places like Barbados, Bahamas, the larger economies. You still have a few foreign banks there. I don't see them, a wholesale exodus of foreign banks.
What I would say though, and this is without doing any kind of survey, but I get the impression that there's certain types of business that they're not interested in. Not that the business is illegal or that there's anything to do with money laundering, but I get the impression that they're interested in the larger transactions and not with somebody who is an entrepreneur who's setting up an international business company in Barbados, etc. Those they want the large multinationals. They're not interested in those. That's just my impression.
I think you're right. I think that comes under this subheading of retail banking. They don't want the small loans or the small farmers looking for X dollars to start up a banana plantation. They're not looking for that. They're looking for the big dollars because there's economies of scale in these kind of loans. And one of the things I think the banks realized the last 6 years was a high level of non-performing loans to small businesses. That's where a lot of them were caught with non-performing loans, and I think they got scared as a result of that.
What do you think is the solution?
Well,
because we need to find a means of getting those remittances in, for the countries in the region that depend on those remittances, even more so now in the COVID environment. What's the solution? Do we start ventures offering these services, more ventures? Do we need, to consider creating banks? People are establishing banks all over the world. What do we then? What do we do? We can't just lie down,
I mean, the foreign banks will leave. What I've read recently that there were some Latin American banks that were trying to take over the assets of those banks that are leaving. So it's not as if the region would be without commercial banking. No, because once there's profit to be made, businesses will be attracted to it. There's no question about that.
I need the banks that are going to provide financing to the risky businesses. And I think that as a region, we need, not just in Barbados, as a region, we need to identify where those opportunities lie, because we accept that COVID has created great destabilization. I mean, we were unstable economically even before COVID. We accept that there are going to be new businesses created, and they are going to be more risky than the multinationals, of course, because they're new businesses by their nature. We are trying to help them to be run properly, so we're training them and we're holding their hands and we're ensuring that they're more bankable and they're planning and, record keeping and doing all the things that are necessary. But we need to identify where those, and I would love to see a situation where the diaspora, perhaps, and some of the reserves held by the diaspora, could play a role in helping to finance some of these startups that will ultimately be created, post-COVID and during COVID.
Well, if you look at, I don't know, look at the experience of some Asian countries, and even, South Asia, they had some experience with microfinancing, and I've seen that they've been doing that in Jamaica as well, where they've done quite a bit of that kind of financing for that kind of a risky business you're talking about. But then again, you see, that's where government could play a very important role in backstopping some of those small loans, so that the financial institution at least has some security to lend. That doesn't mean to say that they'll be giving away money. You still have to do, rigorous credit risk analysis and all they like to make sure that the business is feasible. But there could be some very worthwhile businesses where the entrepreneur doesn't have the capital. And that's where I think government small finance can play a role. Now, having said that, this brings in another important point, and Lynette would agree with me. This is where government is under more pressure now to be disciplined in the way they run their budgets. When government doesn't have fiscal room anymore and buffers, they're unable to do these kind of things. Ayana, you see what I mean? They don't have the leeway to support loans or backstop loans because they're already heavy in debt. Look at the region now. There's no way the governments can really embark on big spending because all are trying to reduce debt. Jamaica just went through a rigorous 5-6 years, and it's still not significantly under 100%. Barbados is over 100%, and some of them are going up towards 100%. Trinidad and Tobago, for example, heading towards 100%. And this is a country which was exporting oil for 100 years. So, this COVID thing and all of this thing really brings out a really important lesson on fiscal, governance. And governments need to really look at their budgets, build buffers, because when these things hit you like COVID and small business financing, governments have the wherewithal to carry out these programs. Absent that, they can't borrow. There's no way because the debt is already too high.
Yeah, Terrence, I want to jump in here. I just want to read a comment coming in. It said, I find that financial institutions are now asking if you work within the civil service or if you have any family members working within the civil service when doing certain transactions. Somebody asked, what about internet banking? And what about the use of internet banking? For example, bankers, trusts. I spoke about trust and the costs to the clients are lower and spoke about user fees. I wanted to add to your discourse in suggesting that governments through the Caribbean have been physically irresponsible for many years, and now we're in a situation and where we got high debts, IMF programs, and all of these respective institutions are not interested in our physical outlets because we are not tied into the financial system to globalization and the like, and systemic failures, somewhat like what happened in the Caribbean with CLICO, which stretched across many different countries and had ramifications for different residents. We still have people in Barbados who still didn't receive payouts from the CLICO collapse. And I saw Jamaica's financial system collapse through bad governance. And since then, steps have been taken to try to diversify away the risks that are associated with financial malpractice. But the fact that we still have governments and the perception of corruption within these governments, I don't think that we have gone far enough to try to protect investors and speaking about particularly the CLICO case and insurance side, not think we've gone far enough to try to protect investors from something like that happening again. And I think that we rely too much on external vigilance from these multilateral players to tell us what to do. And more than likely, they use their force to have the decision-making power transferred within their capacity. But then they will say that you have the freedom to do what you want to do, but the end of decision lies with them. And we are in a situation like that right now with the IMF. And I don't think that we need to go much deeper into situations like that. So you spoke about buffers. I don't know if you know about Barbados' debt situation, but our debt to GDP ratio is back over like 150%. And we have like I said, over $1 billion now borrowed within the space of a year through COVID and other stuff in foreign currency. And we have to now look to pay that back in US dollars. And our international business sector performed way better this year in terms of revenue, but it was predicted that reduction in the tax intake will hamper us in coming years, and we will have a reduced income from the sector. And tourism, like I said, is disappearing. On top of that, we're facing pressure from the larger countries and they are coming down on our main foreign exchange earners in the Caribbean. And I worry for Caribbean governments, especially in their ability to earn foreign exchange to compete within these respective spaces. And these larger countries are using the size and the influence to make these sectors more and more anti-competitive for Caribbean governments. And we having to compete, having to survive, having to still be a part of and still wanting to partake, have to look for extensive amounts of revenue locally, which obviously involves increasing taxation on the masses to try to buy foreign currency to participate within these playing fields that the larger countries create. They create the playing field, they create the rules, they have their own referees, they have their own ball, they bring everything to the table, and we just can't participate. So like I said, I just worry that we will be squeezed within the whole conundrum within these countries. And I think that we need to use and I think I'm using Ayana's point here, using our diplomatic relationships with whoever, the Europeans, Chinese, whoever, to try to allow these countries to understand that Caribbean governments cannot afford to be paying for all of these regulations and be paying for all of these consultations, because simply we don't have the size, we don't have the budgets to participate. So like I say, I look forward to if we could use that outlook to try to get our perspective across. I think I'm more sure Ms. Eastman that under the former Prime Minister Owen After, he would have told the OECD to kick rocks, go fly a kite when they first came here to try to tell us what to do. But now I worry that we have bowed out to the pressure from the international financial institutions and would have given up a lot of our sovereignty and ability to participate within these spaces bias-free.
Kemar, before you, I like the point, but I also want to plug in addition, we tend to give licks to the governments for their fiscal indiscipline. But we also have to plug in the reality of trade liberalization, because the mid 90s and the period of the beginning of some of the issues coincided with our acceding to the World Trade Organization and trying to signal to the rest of the world that we could participate on equal footing. The reality is that a number of our sectors have been impacted severely by the liberalization of trade. And so government, like when we look at our country now, we are at pains to try and identify where government is going to identify that revenue. And this is why I like to switch it back to the operations of firms. We sometimes have been making the point that when we discuss the scenarios and discuss the solutions, I find increasingly that young people have started to not position the firm as playing an important role. And when we were doing well, yes, there was support, and not just we, the region, the Trinidad, Jamaica, and so on. There was government support. There were export credits in Trinidad and Tobago, and the whole long list. But the firms were actually playing their part. They were innovating, they were manufacturing, they were exploring large, diverse areas for manufacture and things like that. So I would like some attention to be paid to what we can do to inspire those firms, along the lines of diversifying, along the lines of jumping in the water in the first place. We have a whole lot of market access that has been negotiated in our trading partners. And yes, we understand, especially now, almost decades later, we understand some of those real supply side constraints, but we don't take advantage of that market access, and it's really, we really want, when we look at the sectors in the region that have been dynamic and that have penetrated the international, like music, in the Jamaican music industry, for example, they were driven by firms. They accidentally got politicians that were invested in music, but it was the firms that took it upon themselves to take advantage of the opportunities. So yeah, government is begging for us to identify the solutions, and I think we need to provide them.
Ayana, I like that point. I want to add to that. There's something I was looking at recently, and it kind of links in with the farm, the entrepreneurship, and so on. I was looking at a thing called, I guess you heard of, it's called the ease of doing business. It's a ranking, right? And I was looking at 2020 indices. Now look, the median index was 95, and that was Philippines. And do you know that most of the CARICOM countries fall below the median? The only country above median was Jamaica and St. Lucia 93. And I can understand Jamaica because they're very innovative in some ways, like they're trying to have call centers and things like that. But the rest are well below 95. Now look who are they competing. They're competing with East Asia. East Asia is always in the top 50 or the top 70 mark. And I don't know, the way they do it, that index, I think what they look at, it's a whole bunch of stuff like ease of starting a business, dealing with construction permits, getting electricity, registering property, getting credit, your point, protecting minority investors, paying taxes. Then you have trading across borders. You're bringing in again that the banks, and the risking. All of that impacts the region negatively. Enforcing contracts. The legal system comes into play. And resolving insolvency. Now, the Caribbean is lagging in these 9 in these 10 sub-indices in one way or the other. And for a long time, I mean, this is not like yesterday we're seeing this thing. Consistently, year after year, they're below the median. Now, I will hope that our decision makers, whichever party in power, are looking at these things and they're trying to do something, because it hits right at what you are doing, Ayana, to get firms to take up the challenge. Firms can take up challenge when you have these 10 things going.
I agree.
much
I
against
agree. I
them.
agree with you. I agree with you. But the nature of our economies, and you know, it's taken a while to try and to understand our economies, and we tend to be government focused. You know, we
We rely on
centralize.
government.
Yeah. And we were having a discussion before we went live and so on about it. But we, and again, in the various discussions that we've been having, you know, COVID is facilitating them because we can have discussions with people all over the world out there. We can get the diaspora to call in like how you have. But the cultural changes that are needed are coming, you know, that question is coming up all the time. You know, why is there that dependence on that government job or that government financing? Why is there that lack of trust, you know, when it comes to new firms or myriad issues? And I agree that while the infrastructure is there, we'll never be competitive if, you know, we don't have that infrastructure there, and government role is to, you know, to prod and to support and so on. But I think that our firms have to take some licks, because there are other indices that you can look at, you know, that have to do with innovation and that have to do with registering patents and things like that, that we are just, you know, sorrowfully lacking behind, you know. And then we want to say that, and we have to start to account for the investments that have already been made. So in a country like Barbados, you know, significant investment goes into education. You know, where I work, you know, we benefit, and we have to ask ourselves, why is it that the firms have not, you know, is it a structural thing where the whole economy needs to be overhauled, as it were, because we're still very colonial in many of the you know, our operations and the structures and so forth. But what is it, you know, that we need to do in order to empower the firms to pivot? I hear a lot of people using that word pivot, you know, and particularly the new firms, because it is the new firms that are going to be spawned. You know, I was thinking the other day that I walked through the malls, the various malls, and because of what I teach, you know, you try to make observations, and we have very few stores in malls in Barbados that are selling products that are locally manufactured, regionally manufactured, you know, so that we can't ask where the foreign exchange is going, you know. So we have to figure out how to empower the firm, how to identify those new sectors that the firms, those that are interested can penetrate, you know, what sectors we need that research to be done. And we are having these discussions at the university, you know, and trying to be more involved in the research that's going to inform innovation and so on. But until our firms are empowered and the people within those firms, I mean, we're just going to keep relying, you know, it's like people talk about spinning top in mud, you know. So I want to comment, sorry,
Yeah, I just want to, I want to make a few points. One of the points I want to make is that when I got involved in the services negotiations, I read everything that I could find on services. And I came across articles that were written in the 1970s, making the same arguments that we're making in 2021. To me, that's a big problem. It means that we have made very little progress from 1970s to 2021. In the 1970s, they were talking about entrepreneurship as well. They were talking about the banking system. They were talking about the new industries. All of these issues have been raised by Caribbean people before. And whenever I think of that, I think of when I was in negotiations in Miami, and I was talking to a US negotiator, he said to me, Caribbean people always make brilliant speeches.
Yes, absolutely.
They're always exceptionally brilliant, articulate.
Mhm.
And when they come back to the next session, nothing much has changed. Now, across Barbados, there is this one issue, and that is that our people do not seem to recognize that there's a need for continual change in everything. So we have an educational system that was established in the 60s, and we are now playing around with reforming it. We have an economy that, while the economies in the rest of the world recognize that they must get involved in other sectors, we're still debating it, which I find absolutely remarkable. The issue with banks. I was talking to an entrepreneur who was asking me about e-commerce. And sadly, I said to him, well, he said to me, after discussing it with me, I recognize that as far as e-commerce and the banking system is concerned, for over 20 years, we have made no progress. And I had to say to him that I am sorry that a young person like yourself, 20-something years old, that you're facing the same problems that probably your father faced or your mother faced, the same problem. Now, the question arises as to why we're not able to make these changes. A lot of our governance is rooted in our political system. And even when Kemar said that he worries about our governments, I was thinking to myself, why isn't he worried about the people? Because it's the people at the end of the day who will suffer. The government actually owns nothing. Everything in Barbados is owned by the people of Barbados. All the money that has to be repaid by the people of Barbados. If there's any change that's going to be made, it has to be done by the people of Barbados. But I would guarantee you, and I've done a lot of canvassing in my life all over Barbados in every single area that you could think of. The questions are not usually about e-commerce. The questions are not usually about improving or doing business status. The question is usually about the light pole in front of my house, or the road down the road, or the well-want cleaning. This is what you get from 98% of the population. So the question is, those in leadership positions, what is it that we do? What is it that we demand of them? Other than having these conversations, when it comes time to vote, what do we vote for? Do we find out if we are going to nip corruption? Because we're talking about firms being entrepreneurial. The larger firms in the Caribbean, what incentive is there for them to be entrepreneurial? What actually happens is that we in the Caribbean, we borrow quite a bit of money. We borrow money from IDB, etc., IMF. When you look at the estimates of income and expenditure, sometimes you could identify precisely the money that comes from the IDB for capital works programs. You can see it. And then in the news, you can see precisely who is granted the contract. So the government seems to be just a conduit for this money to be borrowed, passed through the estimates, and passed into large firms. So even though there are firms which may have assets, if you can continue to rely upon that, Why would you seek to be entrepreneurial? So then those who wish to be entrepreneurial come up against a situation where they don't have the capital. They don't have the capital. While we don't have a national bank anymore, there are institutions that were set up to deal like Enterprise Growth Fund, Fund Access. There are different funds for funding various enterprises. So if all of them were to come together, you probably could make another bank. But the question, the issue raised by Mr. Yip is, how are we going to fund any of these enterprises anyway with the debt situation? For a long time now, and we knew this, for a long time, Barbados stopped getting any grant funding from anybody for years. And to some extent, we were proud of it. We were proud of the idea that we had to go on the road and make our own money, because we were like one small tier away from being developed, and we were seen as an advanced developing country. So like all of that changed. With respect to the trade negotiations, we understood what we were going to lose in Barbados, and the whole idea was to prepare for the loss. I remember there was a study that was published in 2005 when we were going into the negotiations in the Americas. I don't know if you recall that there was a treaty which was being negotiated that would simply be for the Americas, excluding Cuba. So it would be North America, South America, and the Caribbean. And in that study, it said that Barbados, of all of the countries in the hemisphere, was best positioned to take advantage of the new environment. That was in 2005. And I think what happened is that we did not take advantage of it, because in 2005, a lot of things were happening. In the early 2000s, around that time, we had the telecommunications liberalization, and that was supposed to make a vast difference to Barbados. The difference that it made, however, was that people got more technology savvy in terms of the phones and in terms of the rates and who offers the best rate, etc. It didn't really translate into business, which was what was anticipated with this telecommunications revolution. It didn't happen. And I think that we have to address that issue about the fact that we as a people don't seem to realize that there must be continual change and continual reform. As I said before, with the international business sector and what would be coming from Canada, we knew that that would happen. We also knew that, for example, this thing with preferential treatment of bananas and sugar, we knew about that for years. And, you know, the truth is, the WTO, negotiating with CARICOM as a group, agreed to a transition. We didn't take advantage of the transition. Even now, and I must say this bothers me quite a bit, even now, when you're having discussions and you talk about long-term solutions, people start asking you, but what are you going to do in the short term? Short-term solutions cannot address long-term issues. And that's a problem that we have. So Ayana mentioned, for example, the fact that at one stage, we operated as a group. When we were dealing with the OECD, we were in crisis mode. So everybody came together and worked together. All of the relevant ministries in Barbados worked together. Ministry of Finance, International Business, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We pulled all of our diplomats all around the globe in every single forum and represented Barbados's interests. We even set up an organization to deal with tax issues among small states. But then what happened You see, the Europeans know how to play the long game. Because we're short-term thinkers, we only understand the short game. We don't understand the long game. So while we thought we had a victory in the short term, the OECD and the EU were planning for the long term. So what they did is that they invited these small states to be part of a global forum. And we agreed to participate in it directly without having any talks amongst ourselves before we went into the global forum. And they tricked us. I'm of the view that they tricked us. There are a lot of people who wouldn't want to say that, but they tricked us into that global forum. So what happens now is you're part of the forum and you engage in peer reviews. So if you're in the forum, it is very difficult for you to argue against what they're doing because you're part of it. And that is the trick. When we negotiated strongly against those countries, we were not part of any forum. We were here as independent countries. Some of them were, I mean, like Jersey and Guernsey and stuff like that weren't in it, but we all came together, Cayman Islands. Malaysia was there, Trinidad and Tobago participated, even though they were not big into the international business sector, everybody came together. And unfortunately, it seems as though within the region, within Barbados, we only know short term and we only know crisis. So we lurch from crisis to crisis without developing long-term solutions for anything. So we have a spate in crime, and people are saying, should you bring back the death penalty? So you say, you draw to the attention of people. Do you notice that most of these people that you see in the newspapers, these handsome young men who have benefited from healthcare and education, have you noticed that they are fresh out of the educational system? Do you notice that they're 19, 20, 21, 22, 23? If that is so, what is that saying to you? Isn't there something wrong with what we're doing back here that is supposed to prepare them for life? Apparently the preparation for life isn't very good. So we don't want to see the long term. I mean, I know from working in the courts, I know from dealing with some of these young people, that on a daily basis, well, probably not during COVID, young men are kicked out of school at 13, 14, 15. Nobody pays any attention to what they're doing. They end up on the block. Somebody who pays attention to them, they will be happy with that, and therefore they get involved in some of these things. But the broad point that I want to make, especially in terms of what Ayana is saying, is that if we in the region don't get past this short-term crisis mentality, we are never going to address the issues, because as I said, and I never forget this, I never forget when I read that article that was written in 1971, I was there saying, whoa, people were saying this in the 1970s? Yes, they were. And still we in the Caribbean, we who have some of the best physical circumstances anywhere in the world, physical, geography, we still can't do any better, because I don't think that we make the demands that we should make. In terms of our doing business, how we try to correct it is that we try to make it easy for people who come to Barbados to go through the process. That's how we deal with it. So it is Barbados for the tourists first. It is Barbados for the foreign investor first. You ever notice that when you go to England, that they don't do anything special for you? I went to England, they didn't do anything special for me. They didn't put on any special trains, or they didn't do anything special at the immigration department. When I went to the Netherlands, the same thing. I benefited from what was there for their people. And what was there for their people was excellent. So any foreign person who comes will benefit from the excellence. We continue with these shortcuts and these short-term measures for investment. But obviously, if somebody comes here to invest, they're not just going to go to PIPO, they're not just going to go to immigration. Because instead of reforming the whole immigration process, what they would do is take out an immigration officer and send them somewhere to deal with investors that we consider to be important. I think that those things are wrong. We need to reform Barbados and make it high standard reforms for all Barbadians, and then anybody else who comes here will benefit. That is how it is when you go to Europe. That is how it is when you go to Canada.
Lynette,
Clarence, before you
Kemar wants
respond,
us to change
because
the
I want if you
subject.
I'm gonna change it
We hijacked
completely,
the
but
topic
just
away
want to
from
keep
your original topic.
yeah.
All related.
This is his
They're
topic.
all related. Yeah.
Yeah, but Terence, I just want to encourage you to keep your response to this particular point kind of short, because we
That's
got
okay.
some other we got some other topics that we
Sure.
want to get in, and they're quite interesting and quite lengthy as well too. So you can give your reply, Ayana, you can give, and then we will shift on to the next topic.
Mhm. You want me to speak?
Yeah, you can contribute, and then we're gonna have Ayana, and then we're gonna move on to
Okay,
the other
I
one.
was just gonna say what Linda was saying was she hit the nail on the head. 2 points I want to just to add to that. This reforming the system. Whilst I was teaching in Mona, what I observed was that there are people looking for workers to mix cement. I'll give you a personal experience actually. They can't find people to mix cement. At the campus I was staying, there was a water shortage, drought. And I knew the problem. And I called them. They will come one day, they will buy a part, put it. No wonder UV is running out, is getting financial problems. They will keep repairing, and nothing is really done to the pumps and so forth. So one day I called the chap and said, you know something, this water truck that is running over this spot is actually running over a pipeline, and that pipeline could have been it's probably broken. The guy said, okay. So called my buddy, Edsel sent the guy over. They dug a trench, and lo and behold, the pipe was burst because the water truck was running over that track 24 hours a day, and the thing broke. Now, and that water was wasted all the time, wasted. Now, there's a lack of electricians, lack of masons, and so forth. The education system in Guyana, Trinidad, Barbados, Caribbean, English-speaking West Indies, it's all borrowed from England, and it's all geared to academic education. What the Caribbean countries need are people who have skills, people who can fix electrical systems. There's a shortage of that thing throughout the Caribbean. I'm not just even talking about Jamaica. I'm talking about even in Guyana. I'm talking about Trinidad. You don't have skilled people to do these things. I mean, you find them, the ones that are available are very expensive. Our system is really targeted to a different class of students. In Germany, conversely, and Japan, they have two streams of education. One is the academic and one is vocational. And Lynette was talking about the 19-year-old who drops out from school. They have the option of going into a vocational school to learn skills, practical skills. They don't have that in the Caribbean. Very few opportunities.
I can comment here. We are getting there, and there is increasing recognition of the importance of technical and vocational. There's also increasing recognition of the importance of shortening the degrees, so that the learning now becomes, because the more time you'd spend away from earning and learning on the actual job, you're compromising your future and your prospects and so on. So I endorse the call for a modernizing of the education system, but I'm still not sure how we deal with the cultural things. I'm still not sure. I mean, all over the world, the real innovations come from the ghettos. Those tinkerers and those problem solvers. And as somebody mentioned before, the only reason people really do things is when they have a need, when there's a problem to be solved. So we aren't as futuristic as Lynette was saying in our visioning and so forth, but we have to empower those people in the ghettos, those people that can't spell properly, those people that have difficulty reading and so on. Those are the ones that have to figure out how to solve problems. And our issue is to figure out how to solve problems, but I'm still not sure. And Kemar, I'm gonna allow you to, I know you want to get back to a different topic, but I still want some perspective on that culture. And is it possibly the case, to get back to our original topic, that COVID-19 and all of its displacement might create that change in culture that we need, where we allow the public, all of a sudden we saw who is important and so on. So, different players that were unheralded and so on, all of a sudden they're getting their kudos. So I still need help with that issue of culture. And if any of you can help me, and perhaps in terms of your experiences overseas and so on, I still see the need for us to adjust the way that we think and the way that we do things. And that will then probably inform some of the decisions and the risks that businesses take and some of the, the actions that people take. But anyway, Kemar, I see you are itching to change to a different topic, so I will not delay you.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna still intertwine your point into the conversation, but just to give you a little bit of perspective on that, I think, and somebody made the point on the live that many students would have dropped out of school during the COVID period, and you could expect to see the severe fallout of that over the next couple of years, and you know have a situation where people are not, or they don't have the opportunities to become skilled to earn. So therefore, they're going to resort to crime, drugs, selling drugs, illegal activity, anything they can do to really make money. So I expect, unless some intervention is made, that you will have that problem.
But Kemar,
In terms of the
Kemar, and you are well positioned to do it. You need to demand that there's an intervention, not hope that there's one. You need to demand that. Because it is absolutely shocking to me that we have legislation that says that children should be in school, and we have children who are kicked out of school, and nobody, because sometimes the parents are not able to negotiate getting them into another school or into skills training or vocational, because a lot of those things are full. A lot of people, those people are trying to get into those and cannot. And these children are just left. They're still children, they're under 18, they're children. And these children are just left to their own devices now at home because the parents might be out working, the mother might be out working. So I think we need to call for an intervention, not hope there's one. The Ministry of Education should be paying attention to every child when they're expelled from the school, which apparently the schools have the power to do. When they're expelled, they shouldn't be expelled and be thrown to the four winds. There should be some follow-up as to what happens with that child.
So something like I would suggest something like a halfway education institution, that when you're kicked out, you don't go off. You get kicked out, but you go to a specific institution that will cater to your respective need.
Kemar, before you go to the kick out part, the old people say prevention is better than cure, and we shouldn't really even be at the stage where we're kicking out. And when you look at the youths that are kicked out, invariably there isn't anything so wrong with them. They might have some behavioral issue, they might have failed to keep up to the whatever educational standards that had been established. But when you really interrogate them, just a minute, when you really interrogate them, you find that they have some of the technical and vocational abilities that we're talking about. You find that they are thinkers, they think outside the square, they have some of the solutions to our country's problems, so what we need to be exploring is also before we get, I know we're talking about finance and international business, but it's all related. Before we get to the stage where the children are being kicked out because they wouldn't behave, we need to be figuring out how to ensure that all types are accommodated, and so we get the best from all of them, So the educational overhaul has.
I'm gonna.
Come.
Yeah, right. I was gonna suggest, and this is our last, our final point on this topic. I was gonna suggest that a child develops its personality fairly early on in life. So if we're making interventions, the interventions need to be made at the primary school level as opposed to waiting until they get to secondary school. So I think reform is needed in primary schools. I think greater attention needs to be placed on hiring practices in primary schools as to who we let into schools to teach our children. I think reform in terms of the subject matters is needed. I think different approaches to teaching is needed in primary schools. And I think primary schools need to get away from trying to indoctrinate our children into European-like education and focus more on the ideals of a Caribbean-like education, which would then be easier to cure at the high levels as you get older. But moving on to the topic, moving on to the next topic.
The last thing, the attention to dyslexia and some of the other learning disabilities, because we're not paying sufficient attention to those. There's the folks that cannot concentrate and they have ADHD are those that in other societies come up with all of the inventions and innovations. While you're taking notes.
Very, very important, very important. So hopefully we can go somewhere with these suggestions. My next topic would be, since we have two resident Guyanese on the panel, I wanted to touch a little bit on Guyana's oil and using Terrence's word, oil bonanza, from rag to riches. We know Guyana traditionally in the Caribbean, people usually frowned on Guyana, saying no, Guyanese poor, and and we had a huge influx of Guyanese in Barbados, particularly during one of our previous administrations. And then we had a change of administration, and then they were kind of, they did their thing and the like. But I've known Guyanese people to be migrating all across the Caribbean, looking for opportunities for work and they like trying to better themselves going all over the globe. But now the fortunes have turned and Guyanese or people are actually looking to fly into Guyana because of what have happened. And if you're following the news, you realize that Guyana has hit the lotto in terms of finding oil rigs, oil wells, and you have, and I have kind of a pet peeve for this. You have these large international oil companies like ExxonMobil coming down into Guyana and drilling oil. My challenge with that is that the contracts that they're offering in terms of payment to the Guyanese people for this oil are ripoffs, and the negotiators for these deals, in my opinion, they not do justice to the Guyanese in terms of having them paid for their newfound wealth. That's another issue as we spoke about. I'm not saying that anybody was corrupt, but the possibility of corruption, and that with this new to suffer severely in terms of corruption and corrupt deals. I know that we have this big foreign oil. I don't want to keep the conversation only on the corrupt part, but I want to know how we in Barbados, our technical skills, education skills, and what's not can offer services to Guyana in terms of helping them achieve economic growth. Terrence, this is your playing field. So,
Kemar, you want to get me into trouble? You want to get me into trouble?
Well, I mean, you don't have to go on the same tangent that you ain't on. But
by the way, my neighbor when I was growing up was from Barbados. Believe me, at that time, Bajans used to come to Guyana back in the 60s and 50s. That was that was
Mhm.
a wave back then.
That's how come I was born there.
Yeah,
My
and
parents.
my neighbor was from, we used to call her Cousin Sis. Cicely was her name. We said Cousin Sis. But she was from Barbados, and my uncle and my niece actually were living in Barbados and still live there for a long time, maybe long years ago. So I think people have already been traveling across the Caribbean. Okay, now the topic of Guyana oil. As you know, there ExxonMobil was granted a block, they call it a concession, offshore. It's about 9 point something square kilometers of to drill. And they discovered so far over 9 billion barrels of oil. Now, what's 9 billion barrels of oil? Think of that oil, think of Guyana's oil, which is even larger than Ecuador's, which was part of OPEC. And Guyana's oil per capita, 800 million people, is probably higher than many Middle Eastern countries. So it's a lot of oil to think about. And it's all within that block called Stabroek Block. Now, the problem with that agreement was that, and that is what was the argument before the election, was that it was the Guyanese got the short end of the stick. That was that's the argument. What was the contract really in a nutshell? It's what they call a production sharing agreement, which means that Exxon would produce the oil and they would share the profit with the host country, which is Guyana. And so they've created this contract, and the contract essentially boils down to some very simple fiscal terms. One was a 18 million signing bonus. Imagine 18 million bonus. That is peanuts for 9 billion barrels of oil. That's a one-time signing bonus. They also, the Guyana government, previous government, signed with Exxon, 2% royalty. 2% royalty. That's a number that sticks in the craw of a lot of people who've been criticizing the government. And in addition to the 2% royalty, is a 50-50 profit oil split. That is, when they pay all their costs, whatever profit is left, government gets 50, Guyanese government, Exxon gets 50. So right away, you can see that agreement is not going to land Guyana more than, say, 52% profit rate. That is 50% plus the 2% royalty. And how that slipped through the negotiators is a big question. But I wouldn't touch on that aspect of it. But right now, this agreement, they're locked into the agreement. They can't get out of it. And this oil is going to be there for, let's say, another 40 years. They'll be producing it, ramping up production. And then, of course, it will start to decline. But as a result of that agreement, I did some simple analysis. Let's say oil now is now about $65 a barrel. That's the price of oil right now. With $65 a barrel, real price for the next, say, 40 years, the life of the project, Guyana will get $168 billion. 168 real dollars after inflation. That's what they will get with a 52% government take. That is the return on that investment. Now, think of it. If Guyana had negotiated or was able to get, let's say, a more conservative, a more standard type of agreement, they say 10% royalty and a corporate income tax of 25%. Remember, the current agreement, corporate income tax is zero. All they're getting is a 2% royalty and a 50-50 split, nothing more. If Guyana was able to negotiate 10% royalty, which was a more conventional kind of agreement, and a 25% corporate income tax, Guyana would reap 223 billion in revenue. That's a difference of $55 billion more. That's what they potentially gave up as a result of not negotiating a better contract. Now think of what $55 billion could do. That is a lot of money to build good schools, good roads, good hospitals, lots of things, and even prepare Guyana for the time when that oil runs out. And then, if you look at this whole agreement, you could say that, okay, they're getting a 50-50, but surely if there was a corporate tax on top of it, and even a slightly better royalty rate, Ghana would have been so far ahead in the cash flow. So that is why the critics were saying Ghana really left a lot of money on the table. And I leave the politicians to argue over that, but that is the problem, that we are stuck in that agreement that cannot be reopened.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Terrence. Right, just thank you for that, Terrence. We're now gonna pass on to the panel. We kind of getting pressed for time now, because we wanna ask your opinions after this on Caribbean tourism, and then we're gonna wrap up. So Lynette, since you would have intervened first, I will let you continue and speak to anything that Terrence would have said.
It breaks your heart to understand that the country could have benefited so much more. I mean, it makes you wonder what expertise they had for the negotiations, etc. If I'd been asked to do it, I would certainly do research as to what is typical in such negotiations.
Lynette, you hit the nail on the head, my dear. Ghana was ill-prepared to deal with these multinationals. Think of a big guy fighting, it's like Goliath and David in a ring. And you hit a point about you were fooled in that negotiation. It comes to a point I want to make in this, and I wrote that in the book. It's called, and you must have heard of it, it's called information asymmetry. One side has more information than the other. And therefore, there's a bargaining advantage to the one that has more information.
So how could that be in the information age?
Yes, because you see, the oil industries, they have the power. They have all information. They will not disclose that to the host government. So when they go to bargain, they could tell the host country anything they want to tell them. And they have the political power and the capital power. And this has been going on not just in Guyana. The large international oil companies are always at an advantage against developing countries. You see that in Nigeria. You see that in sub-Saharan Africa.
So why, if that is the case, why wouldn't you seek to get Nigeria and other developing countries to share their experience so that you wouldn't make the same mistake?
That's a very good, it's an excellent question, because you would think that the newcomers of the bloc like Suriname and Guyana would seek the experience of Nigeria, of Angola, and these countries. But again, you have to ask what was going on in those negotiations. Why is it, and that's a good question, why they never even thought of asking them that question. Why, for example, in the Guyana, for example, they fined Exxon for flaring gas. That was in the news recently. So they had to reopen the environmental agreement to introduce that provision. When I wrote a post in LinkedIn and asked the question, why in the first place the negotiators forgot to include that clause in the environmental agreement? So I don't want to touch on the word of corruption or people buying off people, because that's a very sensitive political topic right now in Guyana. And that was a debate that followed the opposition and the government that was ousted right up to the election. And there's still controversy in Guyana about that agreement. It hasn't been, it's not been forgotten. I mean, people know about it, but they're getting carried away with all fines that are being, advertised.
So the other thing I want to know very quickly is how are you going to recommend, because even though it's not the money that that we would have liked Guyana to have, they do still have some money that they didn't have before. How are we going to make sure, or how is Guyana going to make sure that this money is spent in such a way that it benefits the majority of Guyanese?
Yeah, and that also is a question that comes down to how they manage that oil wealth. Now, there are two tricky things there. They could spend the money like drunken sailors. They could give it away to the people. That's one option. They could take that money, they could invest part of it in a wealth fund, as Trinidad has done, but Trinidad took too late to do it, and they've learned their mistakes. They could take that money, put it in a wealth fund offshore, and build up a nest egg for emergencies like COVID, for example, or long-term development. And in the meantime, they could use that money very productively in infrastructure. And God knows Guyana, and Ayana knows that too, knows that well. Guyana needs a hell of a lot of infrastructure. The hospitals, the schools, you name it, they are in bad shape. They need that kind of funds. And that's where a lot of the productive investment can go. Social infrastructure, physical infrastructure. That would boost the economy. But if they make the mistake of taking that money and just frittering it away on white elephant projects, vanity projects, it's going to be all wasted. It's going to be again like sub-Saharan Africa. That money is going to be wasted. Nigeria is a perfect example. For 60 years, they've produced over $1 trillion worth of oil. But look where Nigeria is right now. Per capita income is lower than Guyana's. Life expectancy is like something like 50-something years old. Rich oil country which has no electricity in many of the villages, running water. That could easily happen in Guyana if it's misused.
I don't mean to cut you, but I just want to encourage you to wrap up your point quickly. Let's get Ayana. Then we're gonna quickly get a little everybody got like a half a minute to give me a perspective on tourism, and then we want to wrap up. Oh, hello? You there, Terrence?
Yes, I'm here. You want me to wrap up?
Yeah, just wrap up your point, please.
Yeah, the point, but I will wrap up in this way. The result need not be like Nigeria. That's not inevitable. It would depend on management of those resources. It all comes down to this word G, governance. If there's accountability, there's transparency, and the money is used productively, that wealth will transform not only Guyana, but the whole of CARICOM. Because I could see Barbados benefiting from it, Jamaica benefit from it, Trinidad benefit from it, because there'll be procurements for all kinds of capital projects. And these other countries like the CARICOM, where you have a common market situation, they are the ones who will be direct beneficiaries of it. But it all comes down, Kemar, on this word G, governance. And governance includes transparency and almost zero corruption. If they could get those things in place, that money, you could close your eyes and you could sleep at night. But when you add on top of that in Guyana, the racial problems between Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese, it makes for a very combustible solution where race now is intermingling with the fight to control the oil wealth. And that could lead to violence. I'm not saying it will, but it could lead to violence because one party is going to try to benefit one group at the expense of another. And that could happen. It's happened in Nigeria, where you have interfighting between different groups on the delta where this oil is. It's happening in Chad. It's happening also in Libya. And Guyana is no exception. So in my book, I sound like a Jeremiah, but I'm writing it as a nationalist or somebody who's patriotic. And I want them to open their eyes and see it. Look at the experience of Trinidad. Trinidad has spent almost all its oil money, 100 years of oil, and now they're facing the prospects of oil and gas running out within this decade. And their growth per capita, income per capita, has been declining for the last 7 years. You know what that tells me? If this continues, they face a political problem, like what's happening in Chile, like what's going on in Colombia. This could easily happen, and I don't know if these, policy makers are really paying attention to these red flags. That's my point.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your closing remarks. Ayana, over to you.
I don't have too much more to say. I accept, if this is an area of Terence's expertise. I do want to plug in that it is an opportunity. Guyana suffered a tremendous brain drain as a result of some of the same social and political and economic challenges. And as a result, there's a very qualified, very extensive, well-networked, pretty well-capitalized diaspora. And I think that managing the oil wealth needs to factor in somehow attracting them to be involved, whether they can do it now virtually or whatever assistance can be made. I'm seeing too many, when I was traveling to Guyana before the lockdowns, before the pandemic, I'm seeing all of the expats, people are coming from all over Europe and all over the world and taking advantage of this boom. And, there are opportunities for the diaspora, and by extension, there are opportunities for the Caribbean as well. So all of this investment in education and all these engineers, the region needs more engineers to solve its problems. We need to try and encourage, and I certainly encourage my students, don't be too comfortable and don't just stay, graduate and stay here and work in a job that you're not happy with or struggle. Explore the promises and the prospects of these oil opportunities in Guyana. So that's what I wanted to plug in before you wind us up.
Kemar, I will quickly add to what Ayana is saying. That's critical too. Guyana has a small population, and Guyana will really have to reorganize and remodel their immigration policy to admit a lot of CARICOM nationals.
Yes.
You mentioned engineers. Trinidad produces a lot of oil and gas engineers. In fact, many are laid off right now looking for jobs because of the recession there. So Guyana can use a lot of talent from the rest of the Caribbean.
Yeah,
but they'll have to solve a lot of problems like the local housing situation, medical facilities. They have a lot on their table. So they've got to really think of their using the money, or else they could really mess things up easily.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly plug in also, Terence and Kemar, that the university is exploring the Barbados, Guyana, UE, UG, and so on linkages. So you probably saw that UE is going to play a part in helping to retool the Guyanese labor force in some respects. And there are a number of joint programs that we are trying to explore, because I don't know if people know, but the average Afro-Barbadian has a Guyanese relative, because many of the Guyanese that migrated after emancipation to work on the plantations and so forth, and to work and to explore the opportunities in Guyana, they were from Barbados. So many, at one stage, the government in Guyana was comprised of persons that were descendants of Barbados, so there's actually a very close relationship in terms of the, close familial relationships. And so I would like to encourage people to explore, and I encourage my students, even if it's not Guyana, don't just stay in a country because you're familiar with it and comfortable. I encourage my students to travel, to explore, of course, COVID facilitating, but come back. Or if you can't come back, contribute, contribute, whether it is financially, whether it is in terms of network, whether it's in terms of your expertise, what have you. So there are opportunities to be had.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Ayana. I think this was a very riveting discussion. I'm sure that there were a lot of benefits in terms of the panelists. And so what I am going to do, because I don't want to just have them leave just like that, I'm going to give everybody 30 seconds to say whatever you want to say at all to the live, because we definitely have to wrap up now, because we are over time, probably like 7 minutes over time, so we definitely have to go. But just to plug in some of the comments quickly, we had somebody congratulating Lynette's contribution. We had Wayne Hoyt making some significant contributions. We can't read all right now. Marion Griffith, we now see Shane Lowe, the economist, jumping in, Rhonda Paris, and Elite. So 30 seconds, everybody. Let's start with you, Lynette, since the other two had their discussion, and we're going to come around 30 seconds quickly, everybody. Yeah.
This you still wanted us to say something on tourism?
No, we can't right now, because
okay,
we're really over time.
Right. So the discussion was about international business and financial services. So what I would say is that the point that I made before is very important, and that has to do with continual change and continuing to look for opportunities. As I said before, we knew that the international business sector was going to change. What I recognize is that we need to find new industries in which government and the people will invest. We have said for the longest time that the technology, culture, creative economy, that is the way to go, and for government to make real investment in it. I'm not talking about giving a few artists some money. I'm talking about investing in it in the same way that you invest in sugar, tourism, and light manufacturing.
Yeah. Terence, your 30 seconds.
Yeah. Well, the first point again, which is near and dear to my heart, is the oil in Guyana. And my message to the diaspora and even the policymakers in Guyana is, please use the money productively, ensure there is transparency and accountability, and make sure your macroeconomic policies are geared to preventing Dutch disease, which I discussed extensively in my book, because that could ruin the country. And the second point is kind of related to what Lynette is saying. The Caribbean has been resting on a three-legged stool, which is getting rickety now, which is really tourism, agriculture, and finance. The legs are shaky, and they need a little bit refurbishing. Things are changing, as Lynette is saying. The landscape is changing, and they have to be prepared for the new competition they'll be facing after this COVID is over. But it's no longer the old game will continue.
Ayana's turn now. I quickly just want to plug in the issue of culture and the region, the role of the region. But I want to also use my 30 seconds to big up the people who are listening, especially if any of them are my students. I see that we have a lot of fans and everybody is saying that we should come back. But if I come back, Kemar, I do not want to talk about financial services. If I come back, I want to talk about entrepreneurship. I want to talk about the creative industries. I want to talk about cannabis and not just medical cannabis. And there are many, many other areas that I would like to talk about. So I'm willing, Wayne and David and others, but he has to give me a little bit more latitude. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, Ayana, what we're gonna do, we're gonna have you back, but on the other show, because we have 2 shows per week, but this is a broader panel where we discuss everything that you would have put on the table. So you will have you will definitely have that time, but we will invite you on the other show, because this is specifically the show for finance and business issues. But
Right.
we're gonna take you up. We're gonna take you up on that. Lynette, hopefully you can go over there. Terrence, you have to remain here because you are economics and financial man. So I just want to thank you guys for your contribution tonight. It was excellent. As you said, you have some fans. Thank you for viewing, everyone. We look forward to having you every Thursday. So again, I just want to thank you guys for your contribution. Everyone was excellent tonight. I really learned a lot from my perspective, and I hope you guys learned from each other as well. And I hope to do this again at some point. But like I said, we are really over time, so we can't stay long. So thank you guys for viewing and tuning. If not next week, you'll know in a couple of days, the week after, for Finance and Business Thursday. So thank you once more,
and thank you. And I want to commend all of you involved in the organization of this. It's excellent. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Same for me.